I'd like to welcome everyone to the program on the global environment, distinguished lecture for this afternoon. This is the first in a series of public lectures and conferences that will be coming up throughout the coming months and into the next several years that will be presented by the program on the global environment. Today's speaker is Amita Baviskar of the Institute of Economic Growth, Delhi University, and I'm going to ask Professor Kathleen Morrison, the sometimes director of the Center for International Studies, to introduce her to you today. Thank you.
So you know the more introduction there is and the less talk, the more fabulous it will be. But I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Amita Baviskar today. As Mark said, this is the first really large public event of our brand new program on the global environment, which is part of the Center for International Studies. The program on the global environment includes a newly reconfigured major and minor in environmental studies in the social sciences collegiate division, also a graduate workshop on the global environment, public events, internships, and outreach. So we're delighted to get this program launched here. Amita Baviskar is, as Mark said, a lecturer in sociology at the University of Delhi. She has her PhD from Cornell in 1992. She's also taught at Stanford, at UC Berkeley, and Cornell. She's the author of a staggering number of publications, including in the book department. Let's see, I'm supposed to go this direction. A very important book published in 1995 called In the Belly of the River, Tribal Conflicts Over Development in the Narmada Valley, now in its second edition. An edited volume in 2003, Waterlines, the Penguin Book of River Writings. In 2006, she's co-author of Untouchability in Rural India. And in 2007, an edited volume, Waterscapes, the Cultural Politics of a Natural Resource. And many, many scholarly publications as well. Dr. Baviskar's work focuses on environmental politics with a particular focus on social inequality and conflicts over natural resources, or perhaps to borrow a phrase from Gadgil Guha, on the critical tensions between ecology and equity. Her work, I think, is significantly straddles that very difficult divide between scholarship and advocacy, something that many of us struggle with, and makes very substantial contributions to each. I think it's really distinctive in that it's very empirically robust, and yet it's also very deeply personal. And it embraces a range of locales, from the rural to, as we'll see today, the urban, but also always with a critical attention both to, on the one hand, structures of power, and also to the material settings of human lives. So in her workshop presentation yesterday, Dr. Baviskar sketched for us a kind of exceptionally thoughtful, I thought, provocative, and really even, I would say, inspiring vision of the directions of research into the cultural politics of environment and development in South Asia, a perspective which I think is very broadly applicable, beyond South Asia to other parts of the world. So today I'd like us to welcome Dr. Amita Baviskar for the first annual Distinguished Lecture on the Program on the Global Environment.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here. This is my first time at the University of Chicago, and I was told this is a very scary audience, sort of intimidatingly sophisticated. So I'm nervous. What I'm going to present today is part of a larger project on Delhi. And I'm looking at three sets of processes. One, economic liberalization and the kinds of land use changes that have come about because of the creation of a land market, a real estate market of the kind that did not exist before in Delhi. Second, the transformation of public interest litigation in the Supreme Court and in the High Court, and the emergence of a new kind of judicial activism that ties in together with a third process, that's the rise of bourgeois environmentalism. And I look at bourgeois environmentalism as emerging from a new middle class that's been empowered by economic liberalization, both economically as well as ideologically, and that has a new sense of its own entitlements. And I look at how these three processes, economic liberalization, judicial activism, bourgeois environmentalism, together go on to transform landscapes as well as livelihoods in Delhi. Part of this effort is trying to refine environmental debates in India, debates that have tended to neglect the urban. And I think that empirical gap that we've not looked at at urban environments is a neglect that has had conceptual consequences on environmental debates. For instance, I think we've tended to work with ideas of cultural identity that fall back on a kind of sedentarist metaphysics linking people to place. I think this has also led to our easy assumption that poor people tend to be ecologically virtuous and our discomfort and unease when that's not the case. I also think this debate has important implications in terms of our notion of what the environment is all about and the different kinds of meanings that come together around the environment. And in this paper, what I present is a small slice of this larger set of concerns. This paper was originally written for a larger conference on the middle classes in India, and that conference dealt with issues of identity, citizenship, and the public sphere. Now, very quickly, I'll just give you a summary of what I'm going to argue today. And in this lecture, I'm going to talk about city streets as an embodied public sphere, a site for multiple exchanges between differently located people and things. And in this talk, I'm going to focus on three sets of moving things: cows, cars, and cycle-rickshaws, as they navigate Delhi's roads, and on the people who own, use, and seek to control them. So I'm not going to be talking about other things which might be equally important. For instance, vendors and hawkers, especially hawkers of street food, which have also, who've also been recently sort of excluded from the streets through judicial orders. But that's outside this particular lecture's purview. Now, cars, cows, and cycle-rickshaws, all three have been the subject of strenuous efforts at regulation by courts, by citizens groups, and by traders' associations. And I interpret these conflicts as instances of bourgeois environmentalism, the mainly middle-class pursuit of urban order, of hygiene and safety, and ecological conservation. So I argue that collective action in the so-called public interest by citizens concerned about congestion and the collapse of civic infrastructure constitutes a public that excludes the city's poorer sections. And there are other forms of exclusion that are ongoing in Delhi. For instance, the closure of manufacturing firms and industries on grounds that they are polluting, the removal of squatter settlements in order to make Delhi a world-class city, etc. So claims to civic responsibility and environmentalism by bourgeois citizens are contradicted by the simultaneous rise of consumerism in the same social stratum as expressed in the explosive growth of private car ownership. And finally, I examine state attempts to regulate the traffic between cars, cows, and cycle-rickshaws, and conclude by arguing that there are in fact complex interdependencies that avert imminent collision between these different modes and enable the republic of the street to survive. But before I get into the lecture, just a few quick pictures to give you a visual. Something here which lets you do this as a slideshow, right? These pictures are taken in Delhi, in a neighborhood called Kamla Nagar that I'll be talking about. In his strange and brilliant essay, Walking in the City, Michel de Certeau contrasts the panoptical view of New York City gained from the summit of the World Trade Center with the practices of space enacted by those who walk the city streets. The tower affords a perspective for urban planners and cartographers who would remain aloof from the urban scape spread out before them. And yet this panorama city is a theoretical simulacrum, a picture whose condition of possibility is an oblivion and a misunderstanding of practices. I shall follow in Lycett's footsteps to argue that the planned and readable city is indeed a fiction, utopian or dystopian, depending on one's point of view. However, it has real effects in the lives of those who live down below. I shall trace bourgeois visions of the city through everyday practices, in the courts, in the media, and on the streets. I hope to show that the gap between planners' dreams and the everyday practices of city dwellers is not an empty space, but is alive with tensions and contradictions that act as a form of resistance, impeding the realization of bourgeois ambitions. To quote directly from Lycett's essay, "The ordinary practitioners of the city live down below the thresholds at which visibility begins. They walk, an elementary form of this experience of the city. They are walkers, whose bodies follow the thicks and thins of an urban text. They write without being able to read it. These practitioners make use of spaces that cannot be seen. Their knowledge of them is as blind as that of lovers in each other's arms. The networks of their moving, intersecting writings compose a manifold story that has neither author nor spectator." Unquote. Now, Michel de Certeau probably did not imagine that his urban walker could be a cow. His essay speaks of New York and Paris, cities where a cow on the street would be a remarkable sight, even an emergency, attracting fire engines, wailing police cars, and gawking crowds. And yet, his observations are uncannily apposite when applied to cows that do commonly frequent Indian streets. Leaving dung splatters in their wake, they write an urban text without reading it. Their bovine amble traces maps that are etched deep in memory, associations between particular places and nourishment, this garbage dump, that row of vegetable vendors. The everyday practices of urban cows delineate a carefully crafted route and set of activities, from home to forage and then to rest, often on road medians where the breeze from passing traffic helps keep flies away, before setting off homewards once again. They swish their tails placidly and rise unhurriedly to cross the road. Motorists may curse them, but no one dares harm them. In fact, it's not unusual to see a car stopped in the middle of the road, a disembodied hand stretching out of the window to feed stale rotis to the cow in the middle of morning traffic. Now, where do the cows come from? In Delhi University, where the footpaths along Chhatra Marg offer a veritable obstacle course in dodging dung, cows come from the so-called village of New Chandraval, which lurks behind the neat grid of lanes and gullies in Jawahar Nagar and Kamla Nagar, the place that you just saw. Now, developed in the 1950s as planned residential colonies, now increasingly commercial with the ground floor of most houses given over to shops and restaurants, these neighborhoods came up right next to the settlement of New Chandraval. Now, New Chandraval is an urban village, an oxymoron that neatly sums up its hybrid present. Just behind the neon glare and noise of Kamla Nagar, a dense cluster of narrow streets opens out unexpectedly into a yard where old men sit on string beds and smoke a hookah, buffaloes chew cud, and young women shape cow dung cakes right next to parked Maruti cars. This is where the cows come home when they are done with their roaming through the day. Unlike buffaloes, who are too valuable to be let loose to wander on the streets by themselves, cows are protected only after they have calved and can be milked. The rest of the year, they're let loose to fend for themselves. The older residents of Chandraval belong to the Gujjar caste, and they've kept cattle for generations. The village also has Dalit Jatav, has a small Dalit basti, but they don't keep cows. A century ago, the area that's now Delhi University was their village's grazing land, and cows in this place today signify the continuity between the village's pastoralist past and present. When the land was acquired for building the university, Gujjar men were compensated with jobs as security guards in the university, while Gujjar women continued to exercise their right to harvest grass from the overgrown corners of what are now the law and arts faculties and the Delhi School of Economics. While walls and barbed wire and the security guards keep cattle out of these compounds, The street is the sole surviving element of Chandraval's once extensive commons, where the cows have right of way. Now, Chandraval is only one of Delhi's 275 villages, many of which still have Jat, Gujjar, and Ahir families that run dairies supplying fresh milk to neighboring urban households. According to the Municipal Commissioner of Delhi, the city has 3,500 dairies and some 35,000 cattle. The presence of these dairies and the cows that issue forth from them into the city's streets has long been a source of urban angst. The majority are unauthorized, a term that covers a list of crimes and misdemeanors as long as your arm, all condoned as long as the dairy owner pays off the right people. The fact that Chandraval village also has a side business in supplying muscle men for local politicians, property brokers, and others who need someone to lean on or be lent upon also helps give the dairies a degree of immunity from harassment by city authorities. On their part, senior officials in the Municipal Corporation of Delhi have wavered between the carrot and the stick. A massive drive, quote unquote, against stray cattle was announced. These drives are always massive. Was announced in May 2004, with the corporation preparing an action plan and setting up a special task force comprising officers from the water and power utilities besides the corporation itself. According to the commissioner, the task force, accompanied by a strong contingent of police, would be moving around the capital. To begin with, power and water supply to the dairies would be disconnected. Then the cattle would be lifted in special vehicles and taken to 3 temporary cow shelters, which the corporation had recently set up on the outskirts of the city. The very next day, quote, these cattle would be auctioned between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m., he said. However, as dairy owners strongly resisted this move and lower-level municipal officials were reluctant to mess with them, the massive drive was a non-starter. And these kinds of ineffective punitive campaigns have been punctuated by ineffectual incentives. Over the years, the municipality has established 7 legal areas on the outskirts of the city to relocate these dairies, and it periodically announces plans for providing more land where existing dairies can relocate, but the allocations are far smaller than what's required, so the unauthorized dairies continue to flourish in the heart of the city in violation of the Delhi Master Plan and many municipal laws and regulations, and cows continue to walk the streets. Now, matters would have continued thus, but for a public interest writ petition filed before the Delhi High Court by Common Cause, an NGO that describes itself as an organization for ventilating the common problems of the people. Now, Common Cause's members, like those of several such organizations in Delhi, are uniformly upper class. They're retired bureaucrats, army officers, and industrialists whose posh South Delhi addresses attest to their privileged status. The NGO has a history of litigating on urban issues, and in the past, it has tried to secure far-reaching judicial orders against unauthorized colonies in Delhi. So in July 2001, Common Cause petitioned the High Court to end the menace of stray cattle after news reports of people being gored to death by cattle on the streets. According to the petition, I quote, stray cattle squat on roads and throw traffic out of gear, which leads to accidents. The cattle also pose a health hazard, since cows and stray dogs surround garbage dump in colonies and make it nauseating for residents living nearby. The cattle often excrete on the roads, which causes filth and stench all around. And such excreta is a breeding ground for microbes, which could spread various diseases. Also, it is an extremely abhorrent sight. Stray cows eat garbage from rubbish heaps, due to which they fall sick, and their milk is unfit for human consumption. End of quote. So in response, the High Court issued orders to the Delhi government, to the Municipal Corporation, and the New Delhi Municipal Committee to file action taken reports. However, there was little action to report since the municipal authorities pleaded that they did not have the staff or other resources to comply with the court's order to get cattle off the streets. The case lurched on fitfully from hearing to hearing, but nothing very much happened till February 2005, when the news media reported that 2 people had been gored to death by a stray bull in East Delhi. So the court took notice of this incident and once again asked the municipality and the police for their plans to rid the city of the cattle menace. And in August 2005, the judges came up with a novel scheme of involving citizens in the cattle catching efforts by rewarding them with Rs 2,000 for every animal caught. This catch for cash scheme, as it was called, excited great attention and much speculation about how it would be implemented. The judicial order said that the scheme would first be tried out in affluent South Delhi. The municipal authorities protested, saying that cunning citizens would craftily drive cattle from other parts of the city into South Delhi in order to claim the reward. Now, to preempt that, the municipality said that only bona fide South Delhi citizens carrying certificates issued by the resident welfare associations of their neighborhood would be eligible to get the reward. So despite the expectation that the cash prize would bring in crowds of cattle lassoed by cowboy citizens, the MCD reported after 2 weeks that a total of 9 cows had been caught under the scheme. So the menace of stray cattle continues to dog Delhi streets. Common Cause has tried to diversify its campaign by including stray dogs and rhesus monkeys in its list of stigmatized species, animals unwelcome in urban environments. Across India, other cities have also witnessed public spirited citizens banding together to fight against cows. And for some reason, Mysore has been the forerunner in these campaigns, but Bangalore, Ahmedabad, and Chandigarh have not been far behind. And some of these campaigns have been really brutal, with stray dogs being clubbed to death by the municipality in Bangalore. Now, all of these campaigns cite concerns about traffic disruptions, hygiene, and the safety of citizens, as the primary reasons why cows should be banned from urban public spaces. It's very curious, but pigs haven't joined this list, even though pigs actually pose a serious threat to safety, especially in poorer neighborhoods where they've been known to bite and even kill young children. And the schemes for dealing with cows border on the bizarre. There's a scheme to insert these chips called Rumi tags into the stomachs of cows in order to be able to sort of digitally identify them when they're captured. You go around with a handheld scanner and pass it over the belly of the beast to find out who it belongs to, and so on. The petitioners also endorsed the use of a pneumatic blowpipe to tranquilize cattle and carry them away. Now, I call all these initiatives instances of bourgeois environmentalism, a term that needs to be explained a bit. Now, environmentalism in India has long been described as an environmentalism of the poor, to use Ram Guha's phrase. And drawing upon iconic examples of environmental movements such as Chipko and the Narmada Bachao Andolan, the anti-dam movement, scholars and activists concur that Indian mobilization around the use and abuse of nature is intrinsically linked to issues of material distributive justice. So struggles over nature are perceived as combining shades of both green ecological concerns and red class politics, unlike the post-materialist concerns driving environmentalism in the north. Now, Ram Guha has subsequently revised his characterization to discuss another group of environmentalists that are at odds with the dominant current of the environmentalism of the poor. He calls them wildlife fanatics and green missionaries who propagate an agenda of authoritarian conservation by creating protected wilderness areas that exclude forest-dependent local groups. Wildlife conservationists, many of them from former aristocratic families whose hunting was directly responsible for the decimation of animals and birds across India, embody a form of elite environmentalism that runs counter to the political and social concerns that drive the environmentalism of the poor. By conceiving of conservation, mainly in terms of creating parks and sanctuaries, wildlifers fail to recognize how their resource-intensive, affluent lifestyles actually destroy wildlife habitats worldwide. Such habitat destruction is the primary cause of the loss of biodiversity that they purport to save. And this doublethink is a defining feature of bourgeois environmentalism. So if bourgeois environmentalism doesn't show many signs of being concerned about ecological sustainability at the macro level, is it environmentalism at all? Well, its practitioners certainly see themselves as environmentalists, and this is a self-image we must take seriously. Environmentalism is for them a mode of expressing and addressing their anxieties about themselves in relation to their habitat, in relation to physical surroundings, both proximate and distant, and other species. And it should be noted, as an aside, that such environmentalism does not endorse a Catholic love for all species, but discriminates between them on the basis of perceived qualities. So in the urban context, mosquitoes, rats, cows are bad and should be removed, while pet dogs and ornamental trees are good and should be encouraged. And of course, the good species, bad species distinction is something that differs from social group and changes across time. But concerns about health and hazard, about beauty and order, pervade this mode and have precedence over issues of life and livelihood that are central to the environmentalism of the poor. As Dipesh Chakravarti points out, The sensibility that underlies these judgments is expressed, I quote, in the language of modernity, of civic consciousness and public health, even of certain ideas of beauty related to the management of public space and interests, an order of aesthetics from which the ideals of public health and hygiene cannot be separated. It is the language of modern governments, both colonial and post-colonial, and for that reason, it is a language of modern nationalists as well. End of quote. Now, the place of nature in the city is thus a matter to be ordered and regulated. For instance, Delhi's master plan's categorization of land use includes green areas, but these areas are not allowed to take the form of wilderness. The natural and naturalized vegetation of Delhi is to be found on the ridge, the last spur of the Aravalli range that, together with the Yamuna River, forms the parentheses enclosing the old Delhi of Shahjahanabad and the new imperial Delhi. That part of the ridge that has not been swallowed up by encroachments has been gradually cleared of its undergrowth and converted into parks by the Delhi Forest Department. The parks allow citizens to use green areas for recreation in a way that the rough jungle of the ridge does not. Green lawns, tidy flower beds, and neatly pruned trees are a form of nature's government that meet with the approval of bourgeois environmentalists. This improved nature, garden and not jungle, is deemed superior to and is promoted over the unkempt, inchoate luxuriance of creepers and bushes through which scurry partridges, snakes, and mongoose. But just as an aside, it should be noted that Delhi's parks don't quite fit the notion exemplified in Frederick Law Olmsted's design of New York's Central Park, that a park should be an instrument for governing conduct. If Central Park was a site for working class persons to learn from the upper classes how to disport themselves without being drunk and disorderly, Delhi's parks offer not lessons in socially sanctioned recreation, but a refuge for illicit romance. In the gardens surrounding Safdarjung's tomb, for instance, at sundown, when the park closes for the night, one can stand by the gates and see streams of lovers emerging from the bushes, smoothing their hair and clothes, their departure mirrored overhead by parallel streams of large fruit-eating bats emerging from their tree roofs to forage. And to me, this is one more example of the unruliness of Delhi and how government intentions founder on the rocks of the everyday exigencies of couples looking for privacy and park keepers looking for additional income. Now, bourgeois environmentalists would frown on Esmeralda, the fabulous city of water described by Italo Calvino in his book Invisible Cities, where canals and streets span and intersect each other, such that the ways that are open to each passerby are never two, but many. Esmeralda's inhabitants include, I quote, cats, thieves, and illicit lovers who move along higher discontinuous ways, dropping from a rooftop to a balcony, following gutterings with acrobat steps. Below, the rats run in the darkness of sewers, one behind the other's tail. A map of Esmeralda should include, marked in different colored inks, all these routes, solid and liquid, evident and hidden. It's more difficult to fix on the map the routes of the swallows who cut the air over the roofs, dropping long invisible parabolas with their still wings, darting to gulp a mosquito, spiraling upward, grazing a pinnacle, dominating from every point of their airy paths all the points of the city. End of quote. Esmeralda's fanciful map, like the urban geography traced by Michel de Certeau's city walkers, would find no favor with bourgeois environmentalists who prefer to be, to use a Hindi phrase, lakir ke fakir, and unswervingly follow formal rules and regulations, clear lines laid out in black and white. For them, cats, rats, and illicit lovers are unwelcome transgressors to be respectively caught, killed, or confined at home. If bourgeois environmentalists are concerned with the ordering of nature in the city and in the countryside, they pursue this concern through a strategy that further distinguishes them and their activism from the environmentalism of the poor. Citizens' campaigns to control cows and rickshaws, as I shall go on to show, have been routed through the courts rather than addressed to the municipal authorities charged with the responsibility of managing urban life. Impatient with bureaucratic procedures and the politics of compromise and accommodation, and unwilling to engage in mass mobilization of the sort that social movements strive for, bourgeois environmentalists prefer to use their privileged access to the media and the courts to achieve their ends. Bourgeois desires for an ordered environment are reflected and taken up by an activist judiciary, willing to step into the breach left by the executive and legislative branches of the state, especially a regulatory structure that is susceptible to political pressure and corruption. It should be noted that the prominent role of bourgeois environmentalists in the pursuit of urban order in Delhi is rather different from the state-centric process described in the literature on urban governmentality, and I mean the work of people like Patrick Joyce and others. Instead of the post-colonial government monopolizing, to quote Nicholas Rose, the invention, contestation, operationalization, and transformation of more or less rationalized schemes, programs, techniques, and devices which seek to shape conduct so as to achieve certain ends, end of quote, we see citizens at work often at odds with the state administration. Their initiatives recognize that the state falls far short of its modernist ideals and that its authority is severely undermined by the actions of its own agents. It's the sovereign power exercised by the courts, at once arbitrary and extreme, that wins accolades from bourgeois environmentalists. And bourgeois environmentalists are also able to bypass the regular channels of government and approach the Supreme Court and High Court as a first and not the last resort because of how they frame the issues that concern them. Keeping cows and rickshaws off the streets is a matter of public interest, a framing that the higher judiciary endorses. In fact, as I shall go on to show, these concerns do not reflect the priorities of all street users, but mainly those of a section of Delhi's population that uses private vehicles, especially cars. And yet their interests get normalized and universalized as those of the public, while the concerns and priorities of pedestrians, rickshaw riders and pullers, and cows and their owners, and all those who make their money off them, are left by the wayside. So this then is another defining feature of bourgeois environmentalism, that they claim to speak for the entire city and even the nation. And as the section on cars will show, this claim is based upon a fundamental misrecognition of the relationship between class and citizenship, consumption, and civic concern. And this misrecognition is reflected in the doublethink that is at work in the starkly opposed attitudes of bourgeois environmentalists to cows and rickshaws on the one hand and to cars on the other. So, who are these bourgeois environmentalists when they're not filing cases in court, and how may we recognize them? It's hard to generalize about a group that's heterogeneous and encompasses a range of attributes in terms of income and consumption, education and occupation, and property ownership. And to complicate matters further, bourgeois environmentalism is also a more generalized sensibility that exceeds identification with an empirical class formation. But in the context of this particular lecture, if I had to sort of point towards a particular empirical sort of social group, I use the term to capture what in Hindi are called padhe likhe log, educated people. Perhaps equivalent in Bengali would be the Bhadra log. And a group that's instantly recognized by its dress, deportment, and language. They're professionals, usually educated in private English medium schools and holding jobs as civil servants, bank employees, engineers, and university lecturers. They're likely to own their own homes and automobiles over the course of their lives and are, in short, owners of material and symbolic capital. Since the onset of liberalization in the 1990s, this section has been educated into an awareness of its own power and entitlement by newspapers and the media and the television media, which endorse and celebrate this group's sense of itself as the guardian of public interest. The desire to make Delhi a world-class city, a Singapore or Shanghai, is also promoted by the Delhi government, led by Chief Minister Sheila Dikshit and the Congress Party. The Dikshit government has a grand vision for remaking the city, which is hitched to the forthcoming Commonwealth Games in 2010. And even if most of the sporting world considers these games to be an obscure event, the Delhi government would have us believe that they rival the Olympics in importance. Certainly a fair bit of the ongoing spatial restructuring entails capital-intensive construction projects that are crucial for sustaining the patronage networks that keep the Congress government in power. So for the Commonwealth Games, the city must be beautified with all its ugly and awkward elements tucked away out of sight. Yet, were it not for the support from the courts, the Delhi government would have had to temper its world-class ambitions with the need to not antagonize the city's voting population. It would have been difficult to evict squatters from public lands and to remove hawkers from the streets if the government did not have the courts breathing down its neck. Now, among the undesirable objects to be banished from the streets are cycle-rickshaws. in the summer of 2006, the Delhi High Court ordered that within 3 months, all cycle rickshaws be removed from Chandni Chowk, the most important avenue in the walled city of Old Delhi, the oldest commercial hub in the city. The court said that rickshaw pulling was against human dignity and resulted in the exploitation of poor rickshaw pullers by a powerful and influential mafia, and that the unregulated plying of rickshaws caused congestion and inconvenience to the city's commuters. It directed that all arterial roads in the city should be strictly prohibited for the plying of cycle rickshaws, and ordered the municipal corporation, to take strict legal action against violators. Now, ironically, this order caused great consternation among the very people who had petitioned the courts to regulate rickshaws. These were the traders of Chandni Chowk. They had wanted only a reduction in cycle rickshaw numbers, but were instead handed a total ban. As one resident said, we welcome this order, the introduction of other modes of transport like buses that run on, like electric buses in our area, as it will not only improve environment but also make commuting easier for people. However, cycle rickshaw is also an eco-friendly mode of transport and convenient for residents of the walled city, particularly for old people, women, and children. Electric buses on the main road are fine, but in the lanes and by lanes, we need rickshaws. End of quote. As rickshaw advocates point out, the cycle rickshaw is the only non-polluting mode of public transport in Chandni Chowk. It should therefore be championed by city planners and environmentalists. Instead, it's reviled as a cause of traffic congestion and accidents, not only in the walled city, but all over the capital wherever rickshaws ply. It's true, though, that the number of rickshaws in Delhi has increased exponentially. Until the 1980s, rickshaws were restricted to the walled city and to the East Delhi suburb of Shahadra, and were estimated to be about 20,000. In the 1990s, they entered other municipal zones, such as Civil Lines and the Delhi University campus, where they rapidly became the preferred mode of short-distance travel for students. According to the Traffic Police Commissioner, the number of licensed and unlicensed rickshaws in 2002 was anywhere between 200,000 to 500,000. The vagueness of that estimate tells us just how little knowledge and control the top traffic officials have about this mode of transport. Today, there are estimated to be 600,000 rickshaws in Delhi, serviced by about 20,000 mechanics, and backed by thousands of others who own, assemble, and manufacture the machines. According to cycle rickshaw activist Madhu Kishwar, if one includes the family members dependent on the earnings of rickshaw-related work, a total of about 5 to 6 million people in a city of about 14 million live off the cycle rickshaw economy in Delhi. And if rickshaws were banned in the public interest of bringing order to Delhi streets, it would deprive a substantial section of the city's working class of its basic source of livelihood. Now, it is these numbers that bourgeois environmentalists regard with unease. Rickshaw pulling is the quickest employment opportunity available to male migrants into Delhi. It requires fewer resources and skills than other occupations. No financial, educational, or social capital, just the strength of one's body and some basic survival skills. People from rural areas who come to Delhi in the hope of making it in the city can relatively easily hire a rickshaw for about 25 rupees a day and earn enough to make ends meet and perhaps even save some money. The work is hard and the conditions brutal. There's no respite if one is ill or if the weather is bad. The prospect of economic improvement and upward mobility are slim. Yet, such is the need for remunerative work and such are the difficulties of entering other modes of employment that thousands of migrants, and many long-term residents too, take up pulling the cycle rickshaw. And as they doggedly keep their place on the roads, often jumping red lights because that's the only way they can get a head start against the motor vehicles that crowd and overtake them, rickshaws are a conspicuous irritant for car drivers. The men who pull them are marked by their Bihari and Eastern UP accents and quickly identified as migrants. Regulating rickshaws in the name of curbing urban congestion is also tinged with anxiety about the influx of migrants into the city and fears about the collapse of civic infrastructure under their weight. So there's supposed to be only 99,000 licensed rickshaws in Delhi, and the actual number is supposed to be more than 600,000. So despite the court's order and the recommendation of the court-appointed committee that rickshaws be banned on arterial roads, rickshaws are all over the city, even sneaking into the central Delhi exclusive area of Lutyens' Delhi. Part of Delhi's informal economy, what allows them to flourish, is a tightly structured, highly formalized economy of corruption. Since no new rickshaw licenses are now issued, the majority of rickshaws are unlicensed and unauthorized, which makes them liable to be confiscated and destroyed unless the owner can negotiate with municipal officials and pay them to leave the rickshaws alone. And these transaction costs are much too high to bear for those who own only one rickshaw, so only those who own several can survive in the business. By making regular fixed payments to the municipal authorities, rickshaw owners can ensure that their vehicles are untouched. In fact, unlicensed rickshaws are often password protected, with a code word embossed or painted on the back of the rickshaw to identify it as one whose owner has paid his dues to municipal officials. So if rickshaws disappear from Delhi's streets, they will take with them the primary source of earning for hundreds of thousands of workers and their families, and also a significant part of the illicit earnings of municipal and police officials. They will also be missed by those who use them. And this group spans the city's social and economic divides. Members of households that own one motor vehicle often use cycle rickshaws for short trips. There might be a gendered pattern to this usage in that the car or the scooter or the motorcycle is generally driven by the adult male member of the household, leaving women and children to take recourse to rickshaws much more than men. Other reasons also help explain why rickshaws fill a gap in urban transport needs. As streets have been broadened to cope with the increase in vehicular traffic, pavements have been swallowed up, sometimes making way altogether for parking spaces for vendors and for encroaching shops, all of which makes walking more difficult and hazardous. So potential pedestrians and cyclists now take the rickshaw instead. Despite their obvious utility, economic, social, and environmental, the cycle rickshaw is seen to be an embarrassment in a world city in the making. It doesn't fit into the modernist vision of the judges, the bourgeoisie, the Delhi government, even though its proliferation attests to its eminent functionality. People from all walks of life use cycle rickshaws, and yet upper class ones look down on this mode of transport. The court may wish to ban the rickshaws, and the traders might wish to regulate their numbers. But what municipal officials wish for is to keep the rickshaws on the streets, but in a perpetual state of illegality. It is this legal limbo that renders rickshaws vulnerable and fetches handsome earnings for municipal officials and the police. And it's this deep-seated interest that converges with the livelihood needs of poor migrants and has so far neutralized the court's dictum on rickshaws. So even though September 2006 came and went when the rickshaws were supposed to be off the streets, the rickshaws are still there in Chandni Chowk, off the main thoroughfare, but still in all the lanes and by lanes, and they haven't been reduced in numbers at all. There are double standards at work on Delhi streets in terms of how cycle rickshaws and cars are treated in radically different ways. Cars are the big blind spot in the mirrors of bourgeois environmentalists. The number of motor vehicles on Delhi's roads has almost doubled over 8 years, increasing from 1.5 million in 1997 to an estimated 2.7 million in 2005. And cars and motorized two-wheelers make up 90% of the volume of traffic on Delhi's roads, yet there are no efforts to check the phenomenal growth in their numbers. To be sure, there are now heftier fines for traffic violations to encourage people to drive better, but there are no initiatives to keep cars off the roads, unlike the case for cows and cycle rickshaws. Cars pollute. The switch to unleaded fuel notwithstanding, petrol and diesel-run motor vehicles still contribute nitrogen, sulfur dioxide to the air, and the steep increase in the number of private vehicles has already begun to negate the gains from the switch to compressed natural gas for public buses and three-wheeler auto rickshaws that occurred in 2000. And vehicle emissions make up 70% of total air pollution in Delhi. Cars pollute and they cause accidents far more frequently than cows or cycle rickshaws. Yet no one petitions the court to ban or even regulate the numbers of cars in Delhi, the city with the greatest density and the highest numbers of private vehicle ownership in India. On the contrary, car financing makes it easier to own a car. Advertisements on television and in the print media make it clear that a car is something that a scooter owner should aspire to for the sake of his school-going son's self-respect among his peers or his wife's comfort, and the post-liberalization personal loans promise to make the dream a reality in easy installments. The latest in car consumerism is the Tata Group's promise of producing a car that will cost only 100,000 rupees. Just as urban congestion took a turn for the worse after the people's car, the Maruti 800, hit the roads in 1983, the Tata rupees 1 lakh car will probably make traffic problems infinitely worse. But as everyone in this country knows as well, the private automobile is the ultimate fetish of freedom and mobility. Even if it spends most of its time in gridlock and traffic jams, it doesn't seem to lose its aura. Unlike on the issue of cows and cycle rickshaws, on the subject of cars, state practices are much more unequivocal. Cars are necessary and desirable. Those who have the wherewithal to own, drive, and ride them are, by definition, respectable citizens by virtue of their demonstrated property-owning power. The city government has taken numerous steps to smooth their passage. It has built 22 flyovers across major intersections, and out of a total of 42 planned to be constructed in time for the Commonwealth Games. Flyovers allow cars to zoom ahead, but they're useless for bicyclists and rickshaws, and they force bus commuters and pedestrians to walk long distances. Apart from building flyovers to eliminate points where cars have to stop at traffic lights or pedestrian crossings, the government has also constructed elevated walkways or subways at points of heavy pedestrian movement. And this makes road crossings safer for pedestrians, but it's difficult for the infirm and the elderly and those carrying heavy packages to climb up and down long flights of stairs. Pedestrians who decide to cross the road anyway, braving onrushing traffic, are now deterred by median and side barriers. The problem of parking, compounded by the fact there are simply too many cars on the roads, is to be addressed by building multi-level parking lots. It's not clear what will happen when at rush hour all these cars descend onto the streets and attempt to go somewhere. If the roads are crowded, build more roads. This simple supply-side solution has overwhelmingly prevailed over the most sustainable strategy of regulating private vehicles and investing in mass transit systems. The road space available to motor vehicles in Delhi has been expanded by widening roads, eating into footpaths, and allowing motor vehicles into the parallel lanes that were originally designed for bicycles, for instance, along the ring road. But even that has not proved to be enough. So plans are afoot to build an elevated road right on top of the ring road that girdles the city. For the Commonwealth Games, the government plans to build a road on the eastern bank of the Yamuna River, where the Games village will be built, to this Jawaharlal Nehru Stadium on the south part of the city, tunneling and cutting through the historic Humayun's tomb area and Sundar Nursery. Another project seeks to build a 225-kilometer long super ring road along the city's periphery for trucks and buses that enter the city at night. All these schemes are meant to address the chief concern of the car commuter. And as a journalist writing on the business pages, writing a business column approvingly reported of all these changes, but he defined the problem thus. He said, if you're a Delhiite and there's a considerable distance between your home and your workplace, you'll know that your day's work isn't done when office closes. Driving back home, you will have to contend with the most exasperatingly democratic of roads where buses and cycles jostle for space, unquote. Now this phrase, exasperatingly democratic road space, sums up the frustration of the car rider. Delhi just has too many buses and cycles. They must make way to create exclusive avenues for cars and other private motor vehicles. Less well-to-do citizens and their modes of locomotion, walking, cycling, and buses, should be banished from the street. If the republic of the streets is perceived to be a problem, the public sphere of judicial space, where grievances are supposed to be heard and resolved, the space of hearing or sunwai, has already been shrunk by the courts. The voices and perspectives of cattle owners or cycle rickshaw owners and pullers were excluded from the courts that decided upon their future. Now, I've tried to argue for the resilience of the republic of the streets, the fact that the cows and the cycle rickshaws continue to flourish, that the republic of the streets survives in spite of efforts by the courts and bourgeois environmentalists to suppress its unruliness. The embodied public sphere that is the city street reasserts itself, foiling bourgeois attempts to impose urban order by excluding cows and rickshaws. Bourgeois efforts have been undone as much by their own hubris as by their failure to deal with the corrupt collaborations between cow owners, rickshaw owners, and municipal officials, and by bourgeois misrecognition of its own complicity in creating urban congestion by driving private vehicles. So these complex interdependencies between municipal officials, cow owners, rickshaw owners, the contradictions between bourgeois environmentalists' own use of private vehicles have, I think, averted imminent collision between different social sections, and they've enabled the republic of the street to survive. But They have made life much harder for pedestrians, for rickshaw pullers, as well as bicyclists, and they've made these dependent groups much more vulnerable and have left them on the defensive. So I'm not sanguine about the survival of this public sphere. It's contingent upon the continuation of complex equations between state and the elected officials and those who pay them off, the court's fluctuating levels of interest, and the degree of mobilization by bourgeois environmentalists, and last but not the least, the power of those who benefit from the liberalization project to secure their vision. So like Delhi's streets, this path is, too is an adventure into the unknown. Thank you.
Questions?
Well, this is generated out of the memory of our last interaction when you introduced me to the Delhi Metro. So I was wondering how you interpret the metro in Delhi, which is of course now being massively expanded, given that it's on the one hand a form of public transport which is reasonably accessible, and on the other hand has this character of sort of the glittering fetish of modernity of the world city. So it seems in some ways to straddle some of these kind of antinomies that you're dealing with in the paper.
Yeah. The metro does do that, absolutely. It's remarkable the degree of overall approval people have for the metro. Apart from one tiny section of urban planners and transport specialists who say that the metro is much too expensive a solution in terms of public transport, that it's saddled Delhi with these with a huge debt burden, that is never going to be economically viable, and so on. Apart from that kind of critique, everybody approves of the metro. I think in some ways the metro has, to a certain extent, democratized public transport in a city where traffic was getting more and more segregated, in the sense that people who travel by buses would by and large never ever, people who travel by cars or who have generally private vehicles would by and large never get onto a bus, would never get onto a bus anymore. So the metro has created a space where there's much more intermingling than used to be the case. That said, the metro is still not available to, say, vendors, to people who carry large goods, partly because it's too expensive. So people who travel by bus often can't afford to go regularly by the metro, especially for long distances. And unlike, say, the Bombay and Calcutta suburban trains, which have special carriages for people who carry goods, the metro doesn't, in fact, allow that. So there are sections of Delhi's population who still can't travel by the metro. But I think what you're saying is indeed true, that the metro does, in a way, straddle class divides. And I do need to sort of put that in much more into this paper, in terms of how the metro then acts in a way that can offer a counter-example of this sort of to this the way in which the public sphere of the streets is shrinking. Yeah, thanks.
Yes. You mentioned a little bit about the bourgeois environmentalists' actions as being expressions of personal anxieties, and I was wondering if you could, I know that's very broad, culturally speaking, but I was wondering if you could outline maybe what a few of those personal anxieties are.
Yeah. It is indeed a very broad, set of concerns. I think there's a larger literature on modernity and sort of urban citizenship that would have a bearing on this. These are concerns that I think have also been expressed in terms of questions of ethnic and religious identity. I haven't seen as much work as I would like to see on the ways in which ideas of the body are also at play in the ways in which people think about urban space. In terms of, I think, issues of personal safety, of aesthetics, and a kind of urban order that people would desire. I think there's a way in which there is continuity between notions of individual health, which are expressed in all sorts of things. For instance, the rise of people who participate in sort of recreational activities, number of morning walkers, for instance, or people who are joining gyms. It's a sense of the individual self and fitness that's, I think, different from what was the case before. One could also look at, say, the proliferation of certain kinds of, sort of semi-spiritual, activities. Going to particular ashrams, for instance, belief in, not belief, but I think the way in which the following for certain kinds of spiritual gurus seems to have been increased. Also through the televisation of a number, the religious channels that have religious discourses by people like Asaram Bapu, Murari Bapu, and Sudhanshu Maharaj, and so on. So I think there are elements in which anxieties about personal identity, one's own family, anxieties about doing well in a material sense, also combined with spirituality. That is one set of concerns. Another, I think, manifests itself in the rise of these resident welfare associations that try to regulate much more the ways in which personal safety is in fact negotiated through the increase of gated communities, the practice of hiring private security guards, making sure that people who come to work in these neighborhoods are increasingly, they are registered, their identities are, their credentials are verified by the police, etc. This is not something that I've done research on myself, but I think it's a very, very large area that does need to be addressed. Yeah. Does that sort of? Okay.
Thank you very much for that talk, which I enjoyed very much. And you mentioned the Tata car, and that's actually been on my mind a lot. I think it's been on everybody's mind. And I wanted you to reflect a little bit on the implications of the introduction of the Nano, because it really changes the profile of the car owner. It's a super affordable car, and it's being held up as the symbol, if you will, of the common man of democracy, much more so because of its affordability than the Maruti ever was. So it kind of blurs the class lines a little bit, because in fact, the last thing I read said that everybody, and you mentioned this yourself, that everybody that owns a 80,000 rupees Bullet will now aspire to be a car owner. And I'm wondering what, on the one hand, the bourgeois environmentalist will have to say to that, and what that does to the sort of the stark class lines which you were outlining in your talk. How will the new car owner, whoever he or she is, sort of affect the neat divisions we saw in our talk?
Yeah. I'm not sure it will really be that democratic a car. I mean, the Maruti 800 was supposed to be the same thing. I think while it might be easier to afford a car with this new car, running it is not going to be all that affordable. It's going to be a petrol car. I don't think it's going to be diesel. Even if it is diesel, it will still be very expensive. You won't get the kind of mileage you get from a motorcycle. So in that sense, I think while it might be a status symbol to have the car and to use it occasionally, when the whole family goes out, I doubt whether people will be able to, use it as a substitute for other forms of transport, unless they're already, somewhat well off. That said, I'm concerned about the ways in which this what's likely to be a huge increase in the number of people who depend on petrol-driven cars will act as a major pressure group on the government. Already the Indian government absorbs a huge subsidy. It sort of soaks up the difference between world oil prices and the prices that are offered to Indian consumers, partly because it's such a politically volatile issue. So when that constituency of people who care about the price of petrol goes up, I think it's going to be a politically very tricky issue to deal with it. Bourgeois environmentalists, I think on the whole would probably say that this is a bad, this is not a good way to go. They haven't been, I haven't seen any, sort of strong reactions one way or the other, except by environmental groups like the Center for Science and Environment, which are very clear that this decision is going to be disastrous. It's hard to say how this will play out, but I'm surprised that the government has allowed it to go ahead. Well, maybe I shouldn't be surprised because, in fact, that's probably more, in keeping with what the government's already been doing. It's a new development, so I think one has to sort of wait and see what happens. Yeah.
First here and then Justin.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm an ally of the cattle and the rickshaw drivers, so I don't want to give any ammunition to the other side. But it would seem if they really wanted to get rid of the rickshaws and the cattle, that they would try to promote complete legalization so as to interrupt the patterns of corruption, and then they would lose their important government allies. Do you think that would work for the opposition?
Legalize it, yeah. That's what the rickshaw advocates have been saying, that if you legalize it, then if you legalize cycle-rickshaws, then you just do away with, the main source of earnings for the municipal officials, plus you allow rickshaw numbers then to, reflect much better the situation, in terms of supply, demand, etc.
But
yeah.
I was thinking if the pattern of corruption was interrupted, then the opposition could at one fell swoop try to get complete removal, and they wouldn't have the opposition from the government officials because the long-standing patterns would have been interrupted. Or don't you think that would work?
That might work, but it's not going to happen. Yeah.
I was just going to make a comment about the nano car too. It's like we talked about the metro, and maybe that's a symbol of modernity, but the criticism was that it's expensive, and you feel like there's better full cost accounting for the metro, the price of drilling it, the price of running it, the infrastructure to power it, and then that's all in the ticket price. But when we're in the car, the gas is subsidized, the roads are subsidized, people's safety and health is subsidized, and that's not in the costs at all. So it's like people aren't really comparing.
Yeah. And that's true across the...
It's a perfect example of that, Chicago's having the same issues with.
Yeah, and that's true across, all the entire spectrum of different kinds of, modes of transport on the roads, that certain things, you do know about the costs and benefits, including you can, sort of get a sense of the externalities, but with others you don't. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just point of information, Amita. How do the environmentalists, bourgeois environmentalists, as you characterize in this political or the middle class professionals, who on the one hand are associated with all kinds of petitions for cleaning the city, but how do they resolve this problem of domestic rickshaw owners, the rickshaw pullers, while the male members are rickshaw pullers, the female members are domestic. And this is an integral part of the lifestyle of the political or other look in Delhi. So it's not simply the question of vote bank. It's not simply, perhaps it is too much when we demonize our politicians and we say that it is primarily because of the vote bank that these jhuggi-jhuglis or the villages which in fact cater to and provide shelter to these poorer people from the environment, from the smaller cities. It's in fact the Padelikello's requirement. So you must have in fact also thought along these lines. So I just wanted to know. Because I also come from Delhi, you come from Delhi. It's our requirement, and how do we resolve this?
Yeah, you're absolutely right that Delhi would grind to a halt if it wasn't for the services provided by this huge class of people who clean and cook and take care of children, and not just that, but the security services, the courier delivery people, all the rest. I mean, all of the vegetable vendors, etc. All of these are intrinsic to keeping the city, moving and going. What I think the problem in Delhi is that people want the services, the middle classes want the services, but they don't want to deal with the lives of the people who provide those services. So if you earlier looked at Delhi, for every well-to-do neighborhood, there would be a cluster of slums, of jhuggi bastis, which would provide the services to that affluent slum. So along with every planned colony, there was the unplanned, like its evil twin, this unplanned colony that made the planned colony possible. Delhi, like most other cities, has this, has an appalling history of never having provided low-income housing, of never actually acknowledging that there is, this large working class that needs to live somewhere. And that's why the bastis come up in the interstices of the planned neighborhoods along railway tracks, in whatever open space remains to be occupied, and they often make these spaces habitable, low-lying areas and so on. I think things, there've been sort of fitful government policies occasionally of recognizing these bastis, where politicians have felt that these are people to be patronized, their votes matter. There have been particular moments, for instance, if the emergency was a moment when many of the bastis were cleared forcibly, immediately after came a moment when they were in fact allowed to settle down. The time when the Asian Games happened in Delhi in 1982, just before that, there was a huge spurt in the influx of migrants into Delhi to construct buildings for the Asian Games. Many of these people then stayed on in Delhi, and then their bastis were regularized over time by the VP Singh government and so on. From the 1990s, because of liberalization, the way in which what used to be a very regulated, government-controlled land market has now been opened up, has meant that there's a real, it's a very hot real estate market, and land prices have sort of, shot through the roof. Commercial real estate in Delhi and Bombay is as expensive as that, anywhere in the world. So under those circumstances, the land that these quarter settlements are on is just really, really valuable. And so Delhi has seen, almost every day in Delhi there are bastis being demolished, and they don't even make it to, into the news anymore. There is now a ring. Not anymore. That used to be the case earlier, but now when people are moved, it's final. They can't come back, and so Delhi now has this ring of slums and resettlement colonies all around it, and people travel 4 hours a day. They leave at 3 a.m. in the morning in order to come to work. Many of them have lost their jobs as well. On this issue of domestic workers, there's a book that should be coming out soon by Raka Ray, who's a sociologist at the University of California at Berkeley, who writes about the ways in which domestic workers are actually central to the creation of the modern Indian urban nuclear family. That they're not some sort of holdover from some feudal aristocratic past, but in fact urban middle class families where both husband and wife earn, etc. The nuclear household would not be possible without the labor of without these domestic helpers. So servitude, a culture of servitude, of having domestic servants, is actually an intrinsic element of the way in which modern nuclear households are constructed.
So, I was struck by when we were talking about the sort of patterns of exit and exclusion by the bourgeois environmentalists and leagues in Delhi. Noticed that in a whole series of things, in education, water availability, access to the public roads, that the wealthy areas opt out. And I guess the thing that struck me most was that in politics that's true as well. So you look at South Delhi and electoral turnout rates, which I look at, that's the lowest turnout in Delhi in elections consistently. And part of this is because they've given up in democracy as well, to some extent, because you can get what you want wholesale. You can go through contacts, you can go to the courts to try and get things done through those avenues. So I suppose I wanted to ask you about what the political possibilities are looking forward. It seems quite a grim picture. If you think about what the prospects are for establishing some kind of commonality between the haves and the have-nots in the future, both spatially and in terms of politics, that you can re-establish a public sphere, do you see any grounds for hope in this?
Yeah, unfortunately, I mean, sadly, not a lot. Delhi, unlike Bombay or Calcutta, doesn't have a history of any kind of mobilization around issues of labor or work, because it's not an industrial city. And even though in Mumbai went through a whole phase of deindustrialization, I think a lot of the experience of organizing, in fact, lingered. And this is probably something that William knows far better than I. In terms of the ways in which slum dwellers also made claims in places like Dharavi. I think the fact that Dharavi has seen some schemes with NGOs acting as sort of critical interlocutors in sort of making sure that large projects funded, say, by the World Bank around the transport corridor, around the trains, could actually be used to provide low-income housing is somewhat unusual. And those sorts of efforts don't seem to be likely in Delhi. I think Delhi politically has been marked by a politics of patronage, with particular politicians having links in particular bastis, links which then translate into getting them particular amenities like taps or electricity and so on, but not something that actually seems to allow people the right to stay on in a particular place. Yesterday I was discussing the ways in which the politics of recognition works in ways to actually then disaggregate the people who live in a basti, so that the government sort of issues a cut-off date. Everybody who came before a certain time and has the documents to prove it has some sort of slender hope of getting a resettlement plot on the outskirts of the city. And the fact that some people gain that kind of recognition, and usually it's a small fraction, but it's the longest staying residents of a particular basti, means that those people then don't want to engage in any kind of politics of opposition and resistance, because they don't want to jeopardize that chance of owning that foothold in the city, that legal space that will give them security. The people who are the most recent entrants into a basti, just they're sort of living on a hand-to-mouth. They have a hand-to-mouth existence, so they can't fight either. So it's those people who built their homes and who are not going to get anything at all when their homes are demolished, who are the most interested in putting up a fight. And they then get they're sort of squeezed in the middle, and so often there is no unified opposition at all. So I think there are, sort of these sorts of reasons have a role in explaining why there isn't any sort of concerted mobilization around these issues, even though, of course, these issues are tremendously important because they shape both people's access to shelter as well as to work. So even when the closure of industries happened, a closure where there was temporarily an alliance between small factory owners and the workers who worked in their manufacturing units, it didn't result in anything that's much long. That was sort of more long-standing. Whereas when the Supreme Court, when the High Court ordered the demolition of these larger encroachments by more powerful and affluent shop owners and homeowners, then the Delhi government quickly swung into the act and issued and issued orders, and the central government then issued a law actually retrospectively legalizing encroachments by well-to-do citizens. So it's very clear politically who counts. And I often think it's ironic that there's so much NGO talk about public participation in urban governance, and sort of getting slum dwellers mobilized to participate. The people who are really powerful, in fact, don't need to participate, because what they want's happening anyway. So urban governance is this curious thing where you take the very poor and try to get them to form these little committees, and one gets very caught up in this and thinking it's going to make a difference. But there's this larger framework which you can't go to a committee meeting and actually see how power operates. There's certain sort of behind the scenes, taken for granted business that one can't, sort of go out and touch, but you see its effects because the effects are really consequential all the way across the landscape. Yeah. There's somebody there.
I'm curious about what you think about the ban on street food vendors in Chandni Chowk and areas like that, like last year. And this backlash, I mean, like there was a lot of literature lamenting the loss of that part of old Delhi and like that kind of experience. And like there was a lot of literature in magazines like Outlook and kind of celebrating street vendors and street food as this kind of quintessential slice of India type of thing. And also a recent literature on how resilient the small department store has been compared to chain department stores like civic and Food World and stuff. So how do you interpret that kind of literature celebrating and lamenting that loss? Like, because it's not similar to bourgeois environmentalists in that it's not a proponent of hygiene and order and cleanliness at the expense of these, street vendors and street hawkers. So where are those people coming from? What's going on?
Yeah. For those of you who don't know, the courts ordered a complete ban. Actually, it wasn't just Chandni Chowk, it was all across the city. A ban on all food being cooked on the streets. And there was this, the media really took it up and said that Delhi's culture of, eating fresh snacks that are made in front of your eyes, that's actually hygienic and so on, would be in jeopardy. Interestingly enough, the ban has never been enforced. So, in fact, street food continues to flourish. And even though a lot of noise was made about the way in which snacks would disappear, if you look at who's eating on the streets, you actually get very, very cheap meals for, 10 rupees a plate, sometimes even 5 to 8 rupees a plate, which is primarily, which are regular meals of, dal and rice or dal and roti, which primarily go to serve laborers, rickshaw pullers, etc. So when the fuss was being made about street food, it was all a lament about snacks. And it was the fact that people actually ate this food in order to, as basic meals, was not something that the media really focused on. But that said, if you look at who's actually eating street food, as in, vendors out there, it's still a sort of low middle class and poorer people. Because if you look at where the upper middle class is eating its chaat, it's golgappe and dosas and so on. Many of those are actually regular shop fronts. I mean, there might be small shops and small vendors, but most of those are usually, sort of more authorized spaces in regular markets. Whether the, what sorts of effects these will have. There was something else you said besides street food, right?
Well, I was Outlook ran an article talking about how the small department.
Oh, right. That's small department stores. Yeah, I think it's too early to say. First, there were these sort of gloom and doom predictions that the department stores would run all the small vendors and the small individual family-run shops out of business. Now there's it's gone the other way. So they're talking about the resilience of the small shops. I really think it's too early to tell because the big chains have come in only in the last 3 or 4 years, and I think the dust still hasn't settled in any way.
So please feel free to stay for a little while and chat with our speaker and each other. We have some snacks in the back. And meanwhile, please join me in thanking Amita Baviskar.